Welcome to The Commercial Edge, the podcast where business, property and legal insight come together. I'm your host, Elizabeth Rebolledo, lawyer, founder of Ardor Legal and your guide to navigating the commercial world with clarity and confidence. Let's get into it. Cate, I'm so excited to have you today. We've known
Thanks
each
for
other for
having me.
many years.
We have.
But could you share with the listeners who you are, what you do and what you love about your job?
My name is Cate Boleyn. I'm from Queensland Rent Roll Brokers. So I'm a business broker who specialises in rent roll and real estate agency transactions. I've been doing it for about 13 years now. And I guess what I love most about it is, in essence, it's really about helping people move on to the next stage of their career or life or, whatever the next phase might
Whatever
hold
the next
for
part
them.
of their journey is.
Yeah.
Fantastic. Cate, rent roll brokerage, it's a little bit different. You did say you were a business broker that specialises in rent rolls. In my experience, it is a unique area of law. So it's not a standard sort of transaction either. Tell me a little bit about maybe some nuances between like a standard business sale and a rent roll sale.
Yeah, I guess, there's a lot of differences. From a brokerage perspective, I think often with rent roll transactions, you know who your buyers essentially are going to be, which is other real estate agents, people expanding, maybe, moving from interstate. They would often have to have experience already. It's not necessarily for startups unless they've got other ways of funding that. And I guess as well, the way that they're valued, the methodologies used for valuation is quite different. So that's quite nuanced and you need to understand that, to work in that field.
Because a rent roll is an asset in itself, isn't it? So it may not necessarily, you could buy a rent roll business that comes with, for example, your leases and your business name and things like that. But the rent roll in itself is an asset as well, isn't it?
Yeah, that's right.
Yeah.
So most rent roll transactions will be asset sales. Every now and again, yes, you might see a share sale agreement like when it's dealt with as a company. But for the most part, what we most commonly see is that it's an asset sale.
And even with a asset sale or a share sale, you do have to have, it's still quite unique because you have a special sort of provision that you need to deal with, like the Form 6s in themselves as well, which you wouldn't see necessarily in other types of transactions.
Yeah, definitely.
You've got to deal with another piece of sort of asset legislation and all sorts of other things as well.
Yeah, and I guess, there's not realistically. You've got someone, when they're buying the rent roll, they're just taking that rent roll and merging it into their own business. Whereas with other businesses, you might have the current owner staying on and actually doing a long handover transition period where they will be, and sometimes even that will occur and then they'll be sort of paid out fully at the end of that. So, yeah, even just the approach to when settlement actually occurs and when the handover actually occurs can really vary.
Fantastic.
From normal
Talk to
sales.
me about the process that you go through with your sellers. So essentially you're acting for the seller in these transactions and they'll come to you typically with, I've got a rent roll, I want to sell it. Where do you go from there? Like what's that process look like on your part?
Yeah, so I would always suggest that people contact the broker as soon as possible, as soon as they start thinking about selling, because yes, the preparation for selling does start long before you sort of, decide we're going to hit the market now.
List it, yes.
Yeah, so even just with having those conversations, there are things that I would suggest, like get in touch with your accountant and make sure that, what implications there are going to be so that you're aware of that and you can make a good decisions based around that. And also things like preparing the rent roll for sale, just doing an audit, making sure that all of your Form 6s are compliant. Yeah, and just sort of tidying things up. If they're looking to really get a good multiplier, then there are things that they can do to prepare for that. So if they do have some people on low fees, well, maybe look at trying to increase those fees. If you've got a lot of those outlying properties, maybe look at whether or not it's worth, keeping them on and or whether it might be worth it in the long run to maybe move those managements on. Talk to your solicitor about staff payouts and things like that, entitlements, and what the best sort of approach would be for that. Yeah, so there are quite a few things that they can do in the background to prepare prior to listing for sale.
You mentioned multiplier, and I just want to touch on that because in rent roll sales, we do find that we don't deal with the purchase price in the same way you would deal with a standard business sale. So in a standard business sale, you'll find, I'm selling a cafe, it's $35,000. You could be walk in, walk out, etc. But with a rent roll, you've talked about the multiplier. Can you explain that a little bit more?
Yeah, so the multiplier is attributed to the gross commissions that the rent roll's earning, and that's based on projected 12 months, assuming that all the properties are fully let for that 12 months. So what the multiplier will be is determined by a lot of different factors. There's the geographic spread, the level of landlord ownership, what the earnings are, what the additional income, the sundry income is. So all of those things, market conditions, supply and demand, that sort of thing, that'll all come into play to determine what that multiplier is. But the multiplier then is attributed, like I said, to the gross commission. So essentially each individual property will have its own purchase price because you've got what it's earning per year times that multiplier, and then each property essentially has its own.
And how does that play out at settlement? So the price that you might think that you're selling your rent roll for at contract, will that be the price that you get at settlement as well?
Yeah, well, that's an interesting question. We did have, so recently, in the Queensland market, when I say recently, in the last few years, that's recent for me. But yeah, we did have some significant rental increases, and we did actually have transactions that came, especially there was one year in particular where yes, we would go to contract and it would be a certain price, and then there would be all these rental increases that would occur prior to settlement. And of course, just prior to settlement, we revise those figures to make sure we're settling on an accurate figure. And yes, sometimes it was a huge difference because all of those rent increases then, came into effect and the purchase price went up significantly. So sometimes what their finance had been approved on was not the same as what they were needing to settle on. So then they would sometimes have to try to find the extra funding to put in. Sometimes that put pressure on people if they're personal guarantors of a transaction. So certainly, it can vary. That was one example of what we saw, and we had to work out different ways to deal with that. One of them was potentially looking at offsetting it against retention claims, which we might end up talking about later. But
and some people have used vendor finance as well for arrangements where they've got a shortfall at settlement as well. Yeah.
Yes, I've seen things like that. We try to tend not to use vendor finance, I think.
Where possible.
Yeah, exactly. Yes. Not that it's a bad thing. It certainly is a way to get transactions through, and sometimes, for some people are open to it, but oftentimes people just want to make sure that,
they want to move on.
Yeah, that's right.
Seller wants to move on.
That's right.
I always say to clients when I'm acting for a purchaser is that just to remember that rent rolls are fluid.
Yes.
So you might have 110 properties on the rent roll at contract, you might have 105 at settlement, or you might have 115 at settlement. So you've got to account for that difference at some point, and that's part of the transactional risk, or at least a component that you need to take into account when you're signing on to purchase a rent roll, because sometimes these contracts can go for a little while. What's sort of like the sort of lifespan of a transaction for the sale of a rent roll?
So, once it's listed for sale, one of the, unknowns always is how long it's going to take to actually find the buyer. Sometimes the buyers are there lined up waiting. It's exactly what they want. They can jump on it straight away. I've had other ones where, I've worked that market really hard and there's just no one looking to buy in that particular area at that time. So it can take a long time, depending on, whether there's someone there ready to go or not. So that's the unknown part. But once that we actually get to contract, negotiating the terms, putting the contract together, sometimes it can depend on the solicitor's timeframes as to, because that'll go back and forth a little bit between the parties there. But once it's signed, you're generally looking at, you're looking at least 28 days before it goes unconditional. You'll have the due diligence clause, you'll have the finance clause, and often
in the most parts,
Yeah, and often most people will put put those two together. So you're looking at probably 28 days for finance.
Mm.
A lot of people would probably assume it's like a, residential transaction, which is often 21 days, but it's not. It generally goes to 28 days. And again, then if the valuers, because often they'll need a valuation on the rent roll, and if the valuers have a backlog, which they do at different times a year and just depending on their workload as well, sometimes they can get pushed out to 45 days. I've even seen 60-day finance clauses. So it can be, a good couple of months before it's even unconditional. And then once you've got an unconditional contract moving to the other side of that, you want at least a good, couple of weeks at least, I think.
At least
because,
14 days to get it ready for settlement
That's
as well.
right.
Yeah.
You have to know because there's notification, notifying the landlords, notifying, your staff, the staff getting employment interviewed and employment agreements and things like that, notifying the tenants. There's I would generally say that, you need, like you say, at least 2 weeks, probably more if you don't want to be too stressed out by the process. So, yeah.
Moving back to your sellers when they approach you, how often would you say they're coming to you? Something like, I've decided I'm retiring this year and I want to list my rent roll for sale tomorrow.
Yeah.
And what is sort of like the implications of any urgency for a rent roll sale?
Yeah, I mean, I think if it's an urgent sale, obviously then the timeline is more important. So therefore, I mean, and people do have different reasons for selling. Sometimes it is that they don't mind that they're not maybe going to get the top multiplier. They just want to be
illness.
Exactly. Yeah. There can be things like that where they just want it wrapped up and the time frame is what's more important to them. If you are trying to get, your sort of top dollar, you need to be open with your time frame, I think, because often if the time frame is the thing that's guiding it, you're sometimes forced into, people are coming in with low offers, but that's all that's coming in. Sometimes then people feel compelled to accept them because, well, we need to have exactly. Yeah.
How much of the process that you go through with your sellers is sort of an education process to realign expectations or to get them on board with a homework that you send them away to do?
Yeah.
How much of that how much time of that is like an educational process for you?
Yeah, a fair bit, I would say. Certainly from the outset, the appraisal process really is a lot of that, setting expectations because, of course, a lot of people come in and, everyone talks, so-and-so sold their rent roll for this amount and, we don't know that is actually what they sold. Lots of people just want to talk themselves up. So, but getting, what we have as brokers is realistic actual sales evidence of what things actually are selling for, and also with the expertise, you can look at these things and you get a good idea of where the offers will come in. So setting those expectations around pricing is, definitely an education, and also setting expectations around what buyers are probably going to come in with when they're offering. So, for example, like talking about the level of landlord ownership, you might look at that and go, that looks all right, but you need to set that expectation with the seller. Just be aware that buyer would probably consider that a higher risk. So this is the way they're going to mitigate that risk, and letting them know that, so when an offer comes in and all of a sudden they're saying, we want a longer retention on these particular landlords, they're not going to be affronted by that. They're going to be aware of.
Sorry, Kate, you're talking about there where one landlord might own multiple properties.
That's right.
Which if you've got a good relationship with that landlord as a property manager, that's wonderful. You've got, say, 4, 5, 6, 8, 10 properties with one landlord. But when you're selling it, you're saying that becomes a risk for the buyer.
That's right.
Yeah. Why is that?
So essentially because if that one landlord walks away, they're taking a certain percentage of that rent roll. Yeah. So depending on how many properties they own within that rent roll. And yes, a seller will always look at it and go, but, they're going to be bringing more properties on. So definitely from the seller side, they can look at that as a positive. But the buyer, of course, from their side will see that as a negative. And they're always going to, if they're, commercially minded, they are going to view it that way, that yes, there is the potential they could lose a lot of those properties in one hit. So the ways that they might look at mitigating that risk are things like offering a lower multiplier just on those properties
or a longer
retention on that landlord.
That's fantastic. Thank you for that. Just in terms of those of us who've been in the industry for a little longer. We've had over a transition. So when I started maybe 15 years ago, we used to use the property managers used to use the Form 20.
Yep.
And now we're on a Form 6, which has different implications for legislation. Are you still seeing some of those old Form 20s in rent rolls, or are we gone past that now?
Well, I mean, it comes down to how old the agency is. So definitely for agencies that are 20, 30 years old, we see, that there still are some Form 20s there. I've even seen, agreements that predate that. And
I don't even know which one that is.
No, I don't think there was. It's just like an REIQ agreement, really, that wasn't, I don't believe it was legislated even back then, to the point that it is now. So, no, there's been definitely a lot of changes along the way that, but I guess we're seeing most of the time now people would say, well, so obviously if there's no actual agreement there and it's still just this legacy agreement that's carried over, well, that would need to be put onto a Form 6 prior to settlement.
Be conditional. The settlement might be conditional on those ones.
That's right, being converted. And often that's a finance
requirement.
That's right, because, they want to make, they'll say, look, it needs to be up to speed. We've been on the new Property Occupations Act for over 10 years now. One of the things I sort of always think is if you're still on those old forms, what does that mean for what your fee structure is? You haven't revisited it in any of that time. So, and even now there's more, norms around your sundry income and what people are trying to charge there. So, you really do need to be revisiting those forms, I think. And, I mean, some people from a legal perspective, and I'm sure you would be able to comment on this, if the Form 20As are completed correctly and have the assignment clause ticked and initialed, you can assign them. There's nothing to say that you can't assign them, but is it best practice? It's probably not. You do probably want them to be on a Form 6. So that's one of the things when I say about auditing, getting everyone, if they're on an old form, onto those Form 6.
And that's something that I assume you're advising sellers when they do come to you with that. Look, we're looking at listing. One of the questions I'd imagine is, just double checking that your forms are all compliant, making sure that those are in place now. And from a legislative perspective, that difference for these types of transactions, what it has done has really facilitated a much smoother process for the transfer. So in that, from memory, we would have to, with the Form 20s, often for a bulk of the rent roll, obtain the landlord's express permission, consent to transfer that property management right from one to the other.
Yep.
How is it now with the Form 6s? Do we need to get landlord consent? How does that work?
So you don't have to get landlord consent. All of the Form 6s are inherently assignable, but they have to be assigned in the correct manner to abide by legislation. So, and the correct manner is that the onus is essentially all on the buyer, the person who it's being assigned to. So they need to make sure that on their side they're doing the correct thing. But best practice is, the seller is the one who has that relationship with the landlord. So it's better for that news that they're being moved on to come from the seller. So we would always say from a best practice point of view that the seller needs to communicate that, and we put that in our contracts and, to make it a smoother transition. But on the other side of that, the buyer does need to notify the landlords within 14 days, I'm pretty sure it is, from once they take the property over, and they essentially have to give the landlord the option that they can terminate within 30 days if they're not happy with that. So of course, if it didn't come from the seller that, hey, look, we're retiring, we found this really great agent, we're going to pass you over to them, and all of a sudden the landlord just got a letter from the buyer saying, oh, we're your new managing agent, you can terminate in 30 days if you like. Potentially there would be greater losses there.
Why would the seller care?
Well,
it's a very good.
Yeah. Well, I guess because it comes down to a couple of things. I guess. I mean, there's retention. They still could not care because it could be said that that's nothing. Depending on what the contract terms are, I guess the buyer might be able to say, well, no, we're claiming all those properties back, what we've paid for. But also, I think the sellers have worked with these people for a long time. They do have. real estate is very much an industry about people. And I think that, even when they've had enough, they're at the end, they do still want to see that these landlords are taken care of and they are passed over to someone who is going to be able to do the right thing by them. Yeah, but I think, it needs to, if it's not dealt with effectively, they can lose out,
They'll lose
Yeah.
Explain to me what is the retention sort of in this type of transaction? How does that operate? And how does that impact on, I guess, the seller and the buyer?
Yeah, so the industry standard for retention in Queensland, we have a 90-day retention period, and the retention fund is generally 20%. So what that means is that at settlement, you have your purchase price, that we finalise a few days out from settlement, and 20% of that will be paid into the seller's solicitor's trust account and will sit there for a period of 90 days. And
Typically.
And at the end of the 90 days or the retention period, then the buyer can put forward claims against properties that are lost. But of course, this is where you really need a good solicitor on your side, because the contract will state what is claimable, what isn't claimable. And essentially, it's just to capture anything that's outside of the buyer's control. So if they're mismanaging the property and not fulfilling their obligations as a managing agent, well, no, they can't claim that, but they can claim some of these things that are essentially outside of their control.
So I guess essentially with the retention is how it affects the seller is that
that's right.
What happens with that retention fund at the expiry of that 90-day period? So if the buyer has made a claim, if the buyer hasn't made a claim, the amount claimed, etc.
Yeah, that's right. So essentially, the buyer could lose up to 20%, and that's if it's capped at 20%. And this is where I was saying you need to have a good solicitor who knows what they're doing, because some buyers will even try to put through clauses that say the retention is not capped and the seller is liable for all claims. And who's to say that's not 50% of the rent roll? It's not often, I can say in my experience. It's very, very rare that has happened. But worst case scenario, you could be looking at these things. So, yeah, from the seller's perspective, they want to ensure that retention claims are minimal. And also, from the buyer's perspective as well, if they've, calculated things like, well, we're putting on a new employee to take care of these properties and all of a sudden they don't have as many properties, well, that can impact on their numbers there.
So essentially it's in both parties' interest to ensure that there is that smooth transition between the seller and the buyer for those landowners to ensure that they don't both lose out in that sort of transaction. So I always say to our sellers how important it is to openly communicate with the buyer and vice versa with the buyer to the seller, that if you are experiencing any difficulties during that period, to communicate with each other, to facilitate and help each other to assure the landlords or reassure the landlords of that transition being in their best interest as well, where actually it is too, of course.
Yeah.
Fantastic. So moving back to pre-settlement, what do you think is the biggest surprise for sellers when things start to go wrong? So they often, because we would love for all our transactions to go smoothly, wouldn't we, Kate? But unfortunately, that doesn't always play out. So what kind of things do go wrong from even from contract signing? Where do we see that going wrong? And what's the biggest surprise for sellers?
Yeah, I think the biggest surprise for sellers, and this can really hold up settlement, is the PPSR releases. Excuse me. So having someone who gets onto that straight away for them. I've had people on settlement day running around to banks trying to get paperwork, because it was overlooked by their solicitor and, or just of the assumption, I thought that you knew about that. And so, and these things, they will hold settlement up. And often it can be, something that they no longer owe money on. It's been paid out ages ago. They just haven't done the paperwork. That's right. So getting those things checked early on, because they really can hold up settlement.
It's interesting you say that. I often have trouble explaining to the sellers what the PPSR is, and sometimes they don't even know there's a security
That's
over their
right.
company, and then they don't understand why we need a release, and often they're saying to me, "But we're not selling the company, we're just selling the rent roll," and we need to explain to them, like, how it operates and why we need a release and why we need authority from them to communicate with, maybe a minor lender and things like that. It can be a bit of a challenge on our end as well,
Yeah, I can
even just
imagine.
educating the seller as to why it's needed.
Yeah.
But yeah, no, it definitely is important part of that process that often we sort of handle behind the scenes for our sellers as well. And if that hasn't been done, like you said early, it can take a while, just even simply getting a response from one of the banks that have that security.
Yeah.
They all have different requirements. So some might say, well, we need your client to sign off on this. They might communicate directly. We might get a response in a day. We might get a response in 2 weeks.
Yeah.
So it is really important for us as solicitors to deal with those securities very early in their transaction.
Yeah.
So it's interesting. What other types of sort of things start to unravel, maybe in the due
Yeah.
diligence phase for buyers and sellers?
Yeah. So, I mean, due diligence it's often, I've never really, in all honesty, had transactions that fall over on due diligence or where people try to renegotiate on due diligence. I think most, and part of that, I think, probably comes down to because when we prepare the information memorandum that goes out to people, it's very thorough. So they
Mm.
really get a good look at what that rent roll's like before they're making a decision to move
They
on
already
it.
know what they're buying, so they're not
That's right.
feeling that there's
They're
a
actually just
surprise.
verifying the information that's being presented to them. It might be, and I think if anything, it just prepares them to know, okay, so this is what we're taking on. This is how we can, plan for once it's ours, how we're going to bring it into line with our, processes
Mm.
or our standards or whatever. But for the most part, yeah, like I don't often see them fall over
Mm.
unless it's a change of mind and they're just kind of using that as an excuse.
So what would
But
be the big ticket item, I guess, that does cause these types of transactions to fall over?
I think, well, finance, and again, sometimes it's not necessarily that it falls over, but it can make it drag out.
Mm.
So finance, sometimes, yeah, and if they're not going through a financier who's across rent roll transactions, it can make it very difficult, very
Mm.
long-winded, asking for a whole bunch of information that really probably, from the buyer's perspective, it can just get too hard where they go, actually,
Mm.
we're just going to, we're going to walk
Mm.
away from this but if they're using the right,
Financier.
yeah, that's right.
Yeah.
They've got a much better understanding and it does make it all more streamlined. But again, sometimes they might not have the finance, or they think that they do, and they've been sort of given the green light. Sorry, but then as it's all come through, it's sometimes maybe okay, it's not coming up to valuation. Do they have the extra money to put in to make up for it?
Mm.
There's things like that yeah.
It's interesting with the finance. It comes back to that it's not a standard business sale, and you can't use standard brokers, standard solicitors, or
Yeah,
standard financiers in the type of transaction. There are specialists in each of those industries that
that's
work
right.
solely and strictly, or at least specialize and understand the rent roll transaction. Not using one can be quite difficult, even like from a broker's perspective. A standard business broker or a general business broker doesn't necessarily have the insight that you would have, Kate,
Yeah,
in how these transactions operate. So they'll be heavily relying on the solicitors
yeah,
for that transaction. And then they might find if they use their regular solicitors for
exactly.
the business sale process, those solicitors themselves may not have a full grasp of the industry sort of standard provisions and things like that.
Yeah,
Then they're using, their local bank that we've banked with for all these years, or where,
exactly.
and then that sort of starts to sort of
Exactly. Yep.
become a lot more complex and difficult. So again, speak to your broker about who are the best people to work with, who are the best
100%.
people. Even the buyers should be asking someone like yourself, like, who are the banks that finance these types of transactions, so
Yeah.
that we can have the best shot at purchasing.
Absolutely. Even when I'm presenting offers to sellers, like knowing who the financier is a big selling point, I think, when I'm chatting with the sellers and saying, well, these are the offers that we've got here. These guys are going to be going through this bank, and I know, what their processes are and how quickly they'll be able to turn it around, and that they understand it. Whereas if someone is using,
a new one.
yeah, that's right.
That
So
we won't
well, I
mention.
don't know exactly how that's going to go along. But yeah.
What are some things from a buyer's perspective that they could put in place early as well to help reduce that disruption or help reduce those delays or roadblocks along the way?
Yeah. So I think one thing, I get phone calls from people often, and they're very new to the industry, and they've been told get a rent roll, and that'll really sort of, set you up for success, that's all true. But you have to look at it from a seller's perspective and a financier's perspective. The seller doesn't necessarily want to sell to someone who doesn't have a presence in the market, online, doesn't have the experience, isn't set up with all of their processes and systems, and so you can't just be completely new and think that you're a desirable candidate for the seller, because they, again, if the seller can lose out, there is the risk there that they can lose.
Some of these sellers have also had that really long-term relationship with their landlords, and they actually care about who their landlords are going to next.
Yeah,
we have found anyway in our experience.
That's exactly right. And just with the financiers as well, a lot of them, they don't want to lend to someone who doesn't have, sort of less than 2 years experience. And if they're going to lend on a rent roll, that's an asset that can diminish. And so they need to know that it's, the buyer has the ability to retain all of those managements and to potentially keep growing moving forward. So, so I think from the buyer's perspective, just making sure that, you've got all of those, definitely that presence, the experience. And I think other than that, just knowing if there's someone who is definitely, who's already established, I think that they would be looking at, okay, well, what are they going to need staff? Are they going to need to look at updating some of their processes and things like that to take on, a certain number of managements? Is it wise sometimes to maybe buy a smaller rent roll as the first one, iron out the processes, what it's like to onboard those properties, and then move on to a larger
builds up slowly rather than try and grow.
Yeah, buy,
double overnight.
Yeah, exactly, and then go, oh gosh, it's too much for us. So there are things like that they can do. And a lot of it is, really just putting that thought into it. How will we manage this, and getting guidance, probably from other advisors in the industry who, specialise in those areas of onboarding and, streamlining your processes, etc.
With regards to the retention period, do you often see disputes, or do you sort of clock out after that? Or do you see disputes during the retention period between buyer and seller? And if you do, what are the types of disputes you're seeing?
Yeah, so I definitely am around for the retention. I always invite people to, get in touch if they're unsure of things, or just, obviously I'm not providing any legal advice, and I'm, referring them back to their solicitors. And again, this is where you have to have a good solicitor on your side. But yeah, we definitely do. Often it just comes down to, I think one of the biggest things of where we see claims is around someone sending through their notice of termination, but they don't provide a reason why. And a lot of buyers will say, look, we just want to be able to submit it without a reason. And I guess if they don't provide a reason, to me, I always sort of look at that and think, well, there's got to be something, because if they're providing a reason, it's generally something about, we're moving back into the property, or we're
renovating,
exactly. So, and if they're not providing a reason, they're just sort of saying, oh, well, we're just giving it to this one. You sort of go, well, there's something maybe not right there. And lots of people want to avoid confrontation. They're not going to offload and say, oh, we're really unhappy with your service or whatever.
And the contract,
they just want to make it nice and quiet, and we're leaving now. Yeah.
And the contract will, the contract would usually provide that part of that retention claim requires a reason.
That's right. And like I said, you will see that often on the buyer side, they'll be trying to take that part out. But, and again, that's where your solicitor will come in to bat for you and try. And I think if those retention clauses are really well understood and nutted out at the
Well
beginning,
drafted, yes.
that's right, well
yeah.
drafted at the beginning, then there's no confusion when those claims actually do come in. The other side I see as well is that if your seller is notifying all of those landlords prior to settlement, which is what we, advise best practice and what we actually put in our contracts, but they will say a landlord at that time it is often a catalyst where a landlord will say, actually, we are going to move back in, or we've been thinking of selling, or something they may have been sitting on the fence, a decision that they haven't made yet. They'll just use that and
It's
go,
sort of like
actually,
a trigger.
that's right. Well, rather than move over to this other agent, we'll just do this thing now that we've been thinking about doing. So those ones won't be included in those settlement figures anyway. And again, that comes back to you saying it's very fluid, which it is. That's one of the reasons you can lose a few properties prior to settlement. But they're already taken out of the equation then. So when the end of the retention does come and those claims come in, a lot of those sort of ones don't even make up the claims because they weren't included anyway. So I find that, it can be very straightforward. It can be very convoluted if the contract's not, straightforward enough.
Yeah, when we act for a buyer, it's because the standard provisions say yes, you have to get a reason, and the other thing is provide evidence as well.
It. Lots of people don't provide evidence.
So
try to push it through without that.
So they'll say, well, the landlord, because some of these contracts, depending on how it's written, they might even say an intention to sell or an intention to list it for sale or an intention to terminate. So that intention may be notified by the landlord to the property manager by phone. They may not have the physical evidence. So part of what we do, or we try to do with our buyers, is make sure that, from settlement forward, we say make sure you, one, keep a clear record of anything that's coming up for termination and do your very best to get that in writing. So it may even be just writing to that landlord, say, hey, thank you for your phone call. You've mentioned that you're looking at terminating, and trying to elicit a response from them and
just
saying,
getting them to confirm,
correct.
yes, that's right,
could
that
you
is
reply,
what we discussed.
what's the reason for the termination? And then that you're getting both the evidence of the potential termination as well as a reason for the termination in writing.
Yeah.
So sometimes it is easier than it people might think, but not often, but sometimes, if the landlord doesn't want to respond or,
well, that's right, because sometimes you do
difficult.
get landlords that are kind of AWOL,
Yes.
you don't hear from them for years, and then all of a sudden you do hear something, and yes, they're going to terminate, and then nothing else, and it is tricky. So
it's a balancing act, I think, when you're writing the provisions or negotiating the provisions for ensuring that there's fairness between the seller and the buyer.
Oh, definitely.
That you've got that transparency between the parties as to the termination rights and things like that, but also you've got that fairness that, look, if a buyer loses a property during that period, that they're not being required to pay for it, but of course that they're doing they're maintaining their obligation to ensure that they're trying their best to keep those properties.
That's right.
During that retention period, but of course and beyond as well.
Yeah.
So it is sort of like a juggling act to ensure. I've seen some provisions, Kate, and not in your contracts, I will say, where the retention period requires additional requirements on the part of a buyer that seem almost onerous, and I'd like your view on this one. Like I've seen a contract where if the buyer hasn't given weekly reports to the
Really?
Yes. So if the buyer doesn't give weekly reports to the seller
on
then
lost properties along the way.
Yes, and that could be a
Right.
potential right for the seller to terminate. Have you heard of that one?
No, I haven't come across that one yet.
I did think that was probably a bit onerous.
Yeah.
Yes, to keep them informed.
Oh, and
That's
like
good practice.
You brought
I
that
think.
up earlier, having those lines of communication open. Yeah. And often I think sometimes that comes from, you might have the landlord actually getting in touch with the seller first and saying, I don't know what's going on in this office. I've phoned and they've not rung me back. And I would be saying, for the seller, get in touch with the buyer, let them know, this particular landlord's just expressed their concern to me. Can you please have a chat with them and put it at ease and whatnot. So, yeah, you have to, keeping those, and having that good buyer-seller relationship is, I believe, imperative.
Yes.
That sounds to me like if they're putting those stipulations on someone, that sounds like there's not a good relationship
No.
there, or probably not a lot of confidence there in who the buyer is either. So
I suspect they came from the solicitor's office rather than the property
and
managers. But
yes.
look, you see all sorts of things sometimes in these contracts, and it's
Yeah.
really, it's really important that the parties understand their rights and obligations and have someone going through them and explaining it to them
Yeah.
as well.
I think as well, like you were pointing out, where that sometimes you can extend even you've got your retention period and then there can be an extension to that as well. And we do see, if someone has listed the property for sale and they make a claim for that in the retention period, it might be, well, we don't just pay that out then. We're going to keep, the money in the trust account for a further 3 months maybe, or a further 6 months.
We've
sometimes
seen up to 12
see,
months.
to see what the outcome of the sale is essentially. But some people will push back on that and say, no, if it's not sold within that time, I tend to agree that that's what the retention period is for. Like, we have it set at an amount, like when does it kind of end? And again, same with the when people are going to express that their intention to terminate, but they haven't terminated yet. Like, who's to say these people aren't going to change their mind, and how long do you let that go for? And again, I've had some solicitors and clients say, no, if it's not done within this time, then, it has to fall within this time. If they're terminating in that time.
I sort of see the argument on both fronts, I think. I do think, like, for a seller, they do want to have that line because particularly if they have, an urgency to sell, like we've said before, like an illness or a death in the family that they really just want to clock off.
Yeah.
We had a seller that was having a child. So she was selling her rent roll because she was moving to motherhood. So she didn't want
it
it hanging over her head for, beyond her maternity. And then you've got your sellers that are retiring, etc. So I do see that they want to have the clear line. And from the buyer's perspective, I also see to some extent as well, look, they're paying for the management rights for up to, on the value of them, a 12-month period.
Yeah.
So losing it at the
and,
fourth
if
month.
that's a multiplier of 3, that's 3 years worth of income that they're paying for.
Yeah. And they've lost it at fourth month instead of the third.
That's right.
Yeah.
And I do know as well, from a buyer's perspective, like, often they will say if someone has indicated that they're going to sell, like, even if it doesn't sell, they'll relist it again within 12 months and try to sell it again. It's kind of like once a property owner has decided that they're going to sell, it generally will happen. So I can see why they're trying to capture that, because if that intention has been communicated to them within that. So I can understand both sides, but I think from the sake of a nice,
nice, clean.
Yeah,
absolutely. From a transaction perspective, do you have much to do after the retention, or do you hear anything about after the retention, whether it's the restraint provisions or other complications your buyers or sellers may have experienced?
Oh, look, every now and again, yes. It really comes down to whether I'm sort of still in touch with the buyer or the buyer's still around, because often buyers, will buy multiple rent rolls over the years. So every now and again, yes, I will have people say, and generally it is around restraint, and often it is as soon as that is up, the other side is going for that rent roll again, which is I always find that disheartening to hear. I know that, yes, they have abided by, what the restraint is, but I think it just sort of puts a bad taste in people's mouth, I think.
I tend to agree. However, the restraint period for rent rolls is quite different to what you might see a restraint period for other types of businesses. What's like the typical restraint that you're seeing in a rent roll sale?
Well, no, I think some of it comes down to, there's so many different reasons as to what people might put forward. The intention of what someone's going to do after the sale. If they're exiting the industry, people might be a little more, maybe you might be looking at a 3-year restraint. 5 years is normally sort of typical of what we'd see. And I think that's because you sort of go, well, look, let's say they're paying a $3 multiplier and they've got debt servicing on that. Like, it's probably going to be 5 or more years before you've actually paid for those properties. So you don't want someone sort of coming in and trying to take them back. But, yeah, I think, what the sellers' intentions are, if they are still going to be operating, we definitely see that there's a lot more onerous restraint terms there. The goal is that we're trying to protect the asset that's being purchased, which is the rent roll. So they can't act as a managing agent or a selling agent even for any of the properties or the property owners, because it's the relationship that is part of what you're buying, not just that management agreement. So often 5 years is sort of the norm. In other markets, if they're not paying as much, it might come down to 3, or like I say, depending on what the intentions are after the sale, you might see something different there. If they're buying the full agency on a walk-in, walk-out, where, someone's moving out, someone's
You're taking
coming
the
in.
business name, the landlines, the websites, the lease.
That's the lease especially, yep. So then we would see that they might put a kilometre radius, so you can't operate within
a competing business.
And again, some of that can be like incredibly onerous, where you're like, so you're saying if this person does want to, they have to relocate to North Queensland or something. So it still doesn't, it couldn't be the difference between operating, on the northern end of the Gold Coast and the southern end of the Gold Coast. Like maybe that's acceptable. But these things are generally negotiated. But yeah, it can be. I think the average that you see is sort of around that 5 years, and protecting the asset especially.
Absolutely, yeah. And for me, the key difference there, Kate, is that 5 years is actually a lot for another type of business in the most part. So you might see 18 months, 3 years in another type of business, but it is typically that radius. So what's required is a reasonableness, and that sometimes is difficult to communicate to clients when they do ask for like the 100K radius for the 10 years. And I'll say to my seller, well, I mean, it's not really reasonable, and it's probably not enforceable either, which is the problem.
Yeah.
And I actually try to negotiate a more reasonable clause. And look, if the seller is genuinely wanting to just retire, they'll go, I don't care. I'm not interested in working anyway. So we'll just let it slide, because at the end of the day,
it's not going to
impact our client, etc. But if it is from a buyer's perspective, I will actually try and negotiate. Even our clients have said like 100K radius with a 10-year. I'll talk to my clients, and I don't think that's enforceable.
Yeah.
To protect the buyer, I'll actually try to reduce that, which sounds a bit strange, that I'm trying to reduce that kilometre and that time range, but it's more so for the enforceability of it as well, so that they understand that I'm actually trying to protect them, because if that went to court, the courts will say that's ridiculous.
Yeah.
You can't stop someone from earning a living
at
all. But the 5 year is important because it's very specific. And you've said it before, that it's protecting the specific asset that they're purchasing, and it is commercially reasonable.
Yeah.
Because they've bought an asset, they've bought the rent roll, they're protecting solely the rent roll. They're not anti-competitive. They're protecting the asset they've purchased, and they've paid good money for that in the most part. So, that's really, really interesting. So, rapid fire, just to wind it up, I've got a couple of questions for you, and we will just deal with them very quickly. A couple of questions for you, Kate. What's the best thing a seller can do 6 to 12 months before selling?
That's definitely audit. Audit your management agreements. Make sure they're all compliant. Yeah, that would be the biggest thing.
What's the biggest misconception about rent roll brokers?
I think it's that maybe not necessarily if it's about brokers. I think it's more that rent roll transactions are just like a residential sales transaction, which they're not. They're very different. And I think because we're dealing with people who do work in residential sales, they find it difficult to sort of see that it's not the same. So that's what I think the biggest misconception would be.
One piece of advice you'd give any rent roll owner thinking about selling?
That would be to make the call as soon as possible. Phone your broker, and they can help you put together a good team if you don't already have an excellent solicitor, in your corner.
So as soon as they have that thought about lying on a beach for the rest of or playing golf for the rest of their lifespan.
Exactly. Yeah.
Fantastic. Not a rapid fire question, but just out of curiosity, what are the types of reasons that you've seen for sellers selling the rent roll?
Yeah. Lots of different reasons. The biggest one, obviously, is retirement. But also, sometimes it is just people wanting a change. They've might have worked in the industry for 30 odd years, but they're not at retirement age, but they do just want to move into something else. Divorce, people starting families, health concerns. They're always sort of quite sad transactions, actually. Yeah, but they're the main ones. And then often some people as well, I think, do get this idea that they can just sort of flip rent rolls, build it up, sell it, get some money, don't do it for a bit and then do it again in another area. But, so every now and again you get those kinds of ones. But I always look at one of the things being that makes a rent roll more saleable is the length of time that those managements have been with the seller. So if the
relationship with the landlord,
right. So if it's quite a quick little thing, I don't often think there's as much value in those.
We did have that one client remind me, I think he went back to being a cowboy.
Yes. He had the change of scenery.
Yes. Fantastic. All right, thank you, Cate, for being my guest today. It's been an absolute pleasure talking to you, as always.
Thanks for having me.
How can people find you?
Oh, okay, yes. You can always give me a phone call. Am I allowed to put my phone number
Yes,
on
absolutely.
Here? So my mobile 0421 165 856. Got my website, which is www.qldbrokers.com.au, or email me, Cate with a C, CATE, at queenslandrentrolbrokers.com.au.
And if you're on LinkedIn?
Yep, LinkedIn. I'm Cate Boleyn on there. I've got a Queensland Rent Roll Brokers Facebook page and Instagram page at the moment as well.
You'll have to spell both Cate and Boleyn.
So it's CATE and Boleyn, BOLEYN.
Fantastic. Thank you again. It's been an absolute pleasure.
Thank you.
Fantastic. You've been listening to The Commercial Edge, the podcast where we dive into the real stories, strategies, and legal insights behind smart business and property decisions. I'm your host, Elizabeth Rebolledo, lawyer, founder, and fellow entrepreneur. I'm so glad you joined me today. If you've got value from this episode, make sure you follow the show so you never miss a conversation. And if you're building, buying, or growing something great, head to ardorlegal.com.au. We've got practical resources, guides, and legal support to help you move forward with confidence. Thanks again for tuning in. I'll see you in the next episode.